Okay, hey guys. Today I'm talking about traumatic brain injuries. More specifically, the effects of a traumatic brain injury depending on which part of the brain is affected or injured. So just to start off, the definition of a traumatic brain injury is basically a injury to the brain that could be a bump, a blow, a penetrating head injury, moving too fast, anything that would cause a problem with or an injury to any part of the brain. So starting off with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is right here, right up behind your forehead, and it goes about halfway back. The frontal lobe is responsible for planning, organizing, problem solving, decision making, memory and attention, controlling behaviors, emotions, impulses. So the frontal lobe is super important, and that's why when there's an injury to the frontal lobe, there's so many different things that can go wrong. That's not necessarily saying that everything will go wrong, but there's so many things that could go wrong. And that's the same for all different parts of the brain. Just because one part of the brain is affected, and that doesn't mean that everything that could go wrong will go wrong. Every brain injury is super different, and every TBI is the symptoms are very different. The personal responses are super different. Even if you have two injuries that are super similar, that doesn't mean that they're going to respond the same. The brain is a super tricky, complicated part of the body, and there's no way to track or to know what's going to happen or to be able to help it. So going back, so the frontal lobe, some of the things that could be affected after an injury are emotions, impulses, language, memory, and social and sexual behaviors. Okay, so moving on to the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is back here, kind of the back top of your head. So the parietal lobe is responsible for integrating sensory information from all different parts of the body. So it contains the primary sensory cortex. So all the senses send their signals to the parietal lobe, and that's where all the information is stored and made sense of. So anything from sound, smell, heat, cold, pain, all of it is going to go to this part of the brain. This part of the brain also tells us which way is up, and it helps us keep from bumping into things when we're walking around. So that's super interesting. So some of the things that could go wrong after an injury are an inability to locate parts of the body and also an inability to recognize parts of the body. Okay, so next is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is right here, kind of behind the ear. So the temporal lobe is responsible for recognizing and processing sound, understanding and producing speech, and various aspects of memory. So not all aspects of memory are responsible or are held inside the temporal lobe, but parts of them. So there could be some memory problems after, and there will also be hearing loss and language problems, and specifically sensory problems with the inability to recognize a familiar person's face. So it could be your mom, your grandma, someone you know really well, and you're not able to recognize their face. That would be a temporal lobe injury that would cause that. Next is the occipital lobe. So the occipital lobe is right back here. It's the very back of the head. It's responsible for receiving and processing visual information, and contains areas that help in perceiving shapes and colors. So if there's an injury to the occipital lobe, there will be problems with vision, any kind of visual defect, and there's going to be problems with detecting and differentiating between different sizes, colors, and shapes. Next is the cerebellum. Cerebellum is the bottom back. It's kind of when you feel your the end of your skull drop off. It's right up in there is where the cerebellum is. So the cerebellum is responsible for balance, movement, coordination. And it also allows us to stand upright and keep our balance and move around. So when there's an injury to the cerebellum, there will be issues with uncoordinated movements, loss of muscle tone, and an unsteady gait. So next is the brainstem. The brainstem is the base. It's the part that goes down into the neck. It's what holds on to the head and keeps it where it should be. So the brainstem is composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. So if there's actually the brainstem is responsible for all of our involuntary survival functions. So it controls our swallowing and our blood pressure and our heart rate and our breathing. So things that we really need but that we don't think about. We don't have any control over those things, and that's why when there's an injury to those areas, it's very hard because it will create problems with heart rate, breathing, and swallowing. So that is most likely when a person will have a cardiac monitor placed, something that's going to regulate their heart rate. They might be put on a breathing machine. They might have a feeding tube because they can't swallow. So those are some of the issues that could come from a brainstem injury. Next is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is located below the thalamus and above the brainstem. So the hypothalamus is responsible for helping us regulate our body temperature. It helps us recognize when we're hungry or thirsty, plays a role in when we have moods, or it might determine what we're feeling. And it also releases and controls many of the hormones that we need to function. So when there's an injury to the hypothalamus, there will be changes in our sex drive, sleep, hunger, thirst, and emotions. Next is the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is right at the base of the brain, right in front of the brainstem. It regulates and releases important hormones and plays a big part in our overall well-being. So if there's an injury to the pituitary gland, there's going to be problems with blood pressure, with fatigue, depression, sex drive, body temperature, and pain. And if it's a child that hasn't quite finished growing, there will be problems in growth in children if there's an injury to the pituitary gland. Next is the amygdala. So located near the hippocampus in the frontal portion of the temporal lobe. The amygdala is responsible for facilitating long-term memory formation. It also converts and retains learning from pleasure responses and helps us recognize when we're in danger or if we're fearful of something. Another thing it does is it helps in the formation and storage of information related to emotional events. So when the amygdala is injured in a brain injury, there will be problems with memory formation, emotional sensitivity, learning and retention, depression, and anxiety. And lastly is the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is located in the medial temporal lobe, and it is responsible for memory creation and retention. It helps us create new memories, helps us orient ourselves to our surroundings, and basically helps us navigate around the world. So when there's an injury to the hippocampus, there's going to be a problem creating new memories or retaining new memories. Also with mood, confusion, and disorientation. So that's the brain and all the different things that could go on based on the location of the traumatic brain injury. So it's a lot to take in, and traumatic brain injury is very, very complicated. There's not a lot of rules for it because each is so personal to each injury. There's so much that could go wrong, and depending on the severity of the injury, that'll determine the severity of each of the symptoms or the things that are affected. So I hope you guys learned something. I sure did. Have a good day.